How humans alternate the global nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is the unmanaged terrestrial, many agricultural, and managed ecosystems. The nitrogen cycle influences biological systems by creating nitrogen that is available to most organisms.
In addition to natural forms of nitrogen fixation, such as lightning and microorganisms, humans have dramatically increased the amount of biologically available nitrogen in both the atmosphere and on land. Human activities such as the introduction of nitrogen fertilizers in the 1940s have increased in use as populations have grown larger and less developed nations began adopting their use. As well, fossil fuel combustion produces a variety of greenhouse gas emissions as unreactive molecular nitrogen in the atmosphere is oxidized to create nitrous oxides. Also, nitrogen-fixing crops in the legume family, such as soybeans or peas, have a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which increases the amount of fixed nitrogen. Some other sources to be aware of are biomass burnings, land clearing, and the drainage of wetlands, causing organic soils to be oxidized. So the nitrogen cycle is generally a positive thing for the environment. However, there exists a fine balance between the levels of unreactive molecular nitrogen and fixed nitrogen. This balance has largely been disturbed by human activities, as mentioned previously. An example of this is since large amounts of ammonia are being introduced to soils from fertilizers, this gives bacteria the opportunity to oxidize more ammonia into the various nitrous oxides. Whether it be from the burning of fossil fuels or from other sources, NO2 and NO are potent greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming by trapping in heat. Not only are these gases an issue, but they often don't break down until several decades at a time.
Nitrogen deposition and changes in ecosystem composition and biodiversity. It describes nitrogen deposition. It shows the results of amount of reactive nitrogen from the atmosphere to the biosphere when they are gases. There are two types of nitrogen deposition: dry deposition and wet deposition. Dry deposition is a complex interactions between airborne nitrogen compounds and plant, water, soil, rock, etc. Gases basically will have more acidity in them. Wet deposition basically takes nitrogen and compromises ammonium in the atmosphere, which gives it more acidity in the atmosphere. How does nitrogen deposition change within an ecosystem? Nitrogen deposition causes the conversion of heathlands to species-poor grasslands and forests. An example of this is in reading on page 8. It says, experimental additions of nitrogen to grassland ecosystems in England have led to increased dominance by a few nitrogen-demanding grasses species. How does nitrogen deposition affect biodiversity? The experiments that were explained in the reading says that they have showed that where increased nitrate mobility, the nitrate loses also led to losses of nutrient cautions and increases in soil and water acidity. It affects the plant biodiversity because the highest rate of nitrogen loading caused the number of plant species to decline more than 5-fold, and that was stated on page 8. Nitrogen saturation and ecosystem function. Describe nitrogen saturation. It has been a term used to determine change in nitrogen cycling through forest ecosystems. Nitrogen saturation is much further advanced over areas of northern Europe. It's a basically experiment that they processed, and it showed that where there was increased nitrate mobility, the nitrate loses, and it led to loss of nutrition and increases of soil and water acidity. It has been a response to elevated nitrogen deposition. How does this play a role in the ecosystem function? Excess nitrogen became a problem because the trees wouldn't have enough nutrients. They would make their nutrients imbalanced by having too much nitrogen, which changes the way they live. This can cause reductions in net photosynthesis and mortality of trees. Now, this is only in trees, and that is an example. But there's also other ecosystems that have been challenged by elevated nitrogen deposition and saturation.
The link between nitrogen and acidification of fresh water is very complex. While governments have monitored and reduced emissions of some inputs, there are a few inputs that were left unchecked, namely nitrogen oxides. These nitrogen oxides can form nitric acid, a main factor of nitrogen's contribution to acidification. Another is ammonium. Together, these two compounds can greatly change the microenvironment surrounding aquatic ecosystems and throw off their natural nitrogen cycles. The change in the nitrogen cycle causes eutrophication in affected estuaries. This eutrophication is mainly controlled by the nitrogen inputs and an overload of nitrogen. This eutrophication can cause anoxia, no oxygen, or hypoxia, little oxygen. Both have substantial effects, resulting in deaths of a large diversity of life. Clearly, a large loss of life would have dire consequences for the habitat. One of the problems in the study of human activities and their effects on the Earth is that there is not much data for the time without the human activity. This is because it was not until we were advanced enough to have an effect on the Earth that we started studying that effect on the Earth. Because of this lack of knowledge, there are currently studies being conducted in remote regions of the Earth to see how little disturbed regions compare to areas disturbed by human activity. These studies could show humanity's effect on the Earth and could be used to improve our current practices and help preserve the Earth in the future.
The most impactful activity on the enhancement of nitrogen fixation is human activities related to food production. Agriculture today requires large quantities of nitrogen to allow exponential growth of crops. This large amount of nitrogen sprayed on crops then gets into the water system and is released into the air. In order to control the release of nitrogen needs to be reduced in agriculture. Because agriculture relies so heavily on nitrogen, we cannot completely remove it from agriculture. However, we can limit the amount of nitrogen we use on crops and reduce the amount of nitrogen released into the air as waste. The construction of artificial wetlands can also reduce the amount of nitrogen released in the air and through land because wetlands and as well as many streams are great for trapping released nitrogen. These wetlands or streams will effectively reduce the transfer of nitrogen from agricultural land. The improvements of efficiency and fuel combustion is also a future prospect for reducing nitrogen fixation. Reducing the amount of fossil fuels released from cars on the road will help reduce the amount of nitrogen released into the atmosphere. Electric cars such as Tesla are a great example of a way fossil fuels can be reduced. Most importantly, these nitrogen-efficient technologies should be spread to developing regions in order to reduce the overall amount of nitrogen released into the atmosphere. The most impactful activity on the enhancement of nitrogen fixation is.
Over the last 50 years, scientists have seen a large increase of nitrogen into the terrestrial nitrogen cycle. This has been caused by the human altering of the nitrogen cycle with the combination of fossil fuels and the production of nitrogen fertilizers and so many more. This will then cause the alteration to the carbon cycle. With alteration to the carbon cycle, carbon dioxide rates will increase, and the ecosystem's response rates will also increase. Human altering of the nitrogen cycle using fossil fuels and nitrogen fertilizers has been causing the nitrogen input into the atmosphere to double, and these rates are just continuing to grow as the years come on. This is causing a loss of biological diversity within the ecosystems. Human altering of the nitrogen cycles has a negative effect on both the atmosphere and ecosystems. Without improvement in the efficiency of both fuel combustion and the airborne byproducts, these emissions will not be reduced.